today with a very good achievement of records and public service. And first of all, I will start with Dr. Leila Al-Baradei. She is my colleague. We worked together for 14 years at the American University in Cairo, and still will continue to work for years to come. And she is one of the founding faculty for the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. She was an associate dean for research, and also she was a dean herself for 2 years. She is one of the great authors and one of the important cornerstone of the American University in Cairo. She's very activist in terms of the students' engagement, and also she's running the policy hub or the policy lab. That was her invention. And Dr. Leila is always coming out with a nice creative ideas, and also she's good in bringing partnerships and bringing students together. And she has a model of the old faculties who like to take the students to a learning experience, to journey to America, to around Egypt. So it's always great to work with Dr. Leila. She is going to be talking about her topic on public policy studies and the research in the Arab world. So in Egypt. So Dr. Leila, you are going to have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid. These compliments you get when you come to a school where the dean is your colleague, former colleague. So you get lots of compliments. So it's really a privilege working with Dr. Hamid. It has always been a privilege. Without further ado, my topic today is about public policy studies and research in Egypt. And the whole idea is that public policy studies and research is such a problem-oriented area, building on various disciplines, as you all know, taking from the fields of political science, public administration, economics, and other disciplines as well. It has been described in many different ways. Interestingly, it has been described as a big tent, as a porous field that's always taking momentum from other disciplines, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Main feature is that it's there to try to get the politicians to come up with better policies that would create and contribute to public value. The idea of public policy has always been there in Egypt for a long time, but it's relatively a new discipline and a field of study. It has been described by Egyptian scholars in many different ways. For example, Gom'a, one of my supervisors for the PhDs, referred to how it was always there in the 1960s and 70s as a field of study, but it was not referred to as a public policy discipline. It was studied within other disciplines like political science, economics, and even in sociology, but not recognized as a standalone discipline. We had other scholars like Ali Din Hilal pointing out to the importance of having a democratic context for the study and practice, definitely, of public policy. He pointed out that clearly. And we had other scholars doing comparative research between theses and dissertations and trying to figure out the main features of the developed theses and dissertations in public universities in Egypt. I shared with a former colleague of ours, Dr. Jennifer Bremer, a piece of research trying to compare the different schools in Egypt that were offering standalone programs in public policy and public administration. And at that point in time, 2008 it was, we did not have any accredited public policy programs, but definitely the situation has changed. The American University in Cairo got both its MPA and MPP programs accredited, and similarly, the situation here in Doha Institute as well. Things have changed. The research problem is that the field in Egypt is relatively new, although there are a lot of public policy studies tackling specific policy issues. but very limited studies that have delved and explored the field of study and research of public policy in Egypt. So what's available is limited and needs updating. So we decided to take on this study and try to figure out an answer for the what, where, how of public policy studies in Egypt, and also try to figure out the challenges faced and suggest some recommendations how to overcome some of these challenges faced. The where, we wanted to figure out where public policy is researched and studied, which academic programs are offered, which training institutes are functioning, think tanks, what topics do they actually delve into and research, what methodologies they use, monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, if used, what are they, and what are the challenges relating to the M&E of public policy in Egypt, and the why we're delving into the challenges faced and how to overcome them. We relied definitely on a review of the published literature, a desk research, plus an online survey with a purposive sample of 32 respondents coming from universities, faculty who are teaching public policy, plus experts and researchers in the field of public policy. And we managed to also get to interview a couple of policymakers, members of parliament in Egypt, and get their opinions about the where, how, why questions. So where is public policy being offered? There are higher education institutes that offer public policy programs as standalone programs. So there's an MPP program at the American University in Cairo. There are 3 other programs, standalone master's level, that offer masters in public administration, and public policy is dealt within the public administration curricula. Other places where public policy is taught as a subtopic within political science, for example, courses within economics, and we have some public universities and some newly established, relatively newly established, I'm getting old, meaning in the 90s we started having private universities in Egypt. Before that, all universities in Egypt were public, with the exception of AUC, non-profit since more than 100 years ago. And there are some new universities like Al Galala University, which is a new type of universities coming up in Egypt, referred to as Ahliya, but it's actually owned by government and has unique features that it's capable of charging tuition fees, and it's affiliated usually to a public university. So a new category of universities, and they're also offering courses and subtopics related to public policy. There are also higher education institutes where public policy training occurs, a number of centers in both public and private universities all over Egypt. This is a word diagram from the survey results that shows the frequency of mention of the public policy academic and training programs. Top on the list is the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University, where there's a standalone department for public administration, and also AUC and Future University. Where public policy research is conducted and produced, the research centers and think tanks in Egypt, different types of research centers. A number of them are government affiliated, like the Information and Decision Support Center reporting to the Cabinet of Ministers, like the work done through the Institute of National Planning, again, a part of the Ministry of Planning. There are other research centers and think tanks that are based in universities, like a number of programs at public universities and others at the American University in Cairo, including the Public Policy Hub project that I'm directing, and you'll be hearing more about on Thursday from the participants here who graduated from the Public Policy Hub program. There are also nonprofit and private research centers and think tanks. Some do have a regional focus, like the ERF, the Economic Research Forum, and the others are private sector. Some are profit-oriented, like Zanetti Consulting Firm, for example, also producing policy research. This is a word diagram where also, again, we have the Strategic Center of Al-Ahram standing out, the Egypt Center for Economic Studies also standing out by and being mentioned frequently by the respondents. What kind of policy studies they come up with? There is a whole range of issues ranging from social policies, employment, health, global public service reform policies. The word diagram here shows that health during the study period and economic policies were standing out. It was the period of COVID, so it was understandable and expected that health issues would be on top of the agenda, and similarly economic issues, taking into account the economic situation we're all going into and the difficulties related thereto, and therefore a lot of people produced policy research dealing with economic issues. Just a side remark that despite this variety of issues and topics, the actual final output being published on the Web of Science under the name of Egyptian Public University is fairly limited. So there's a very limited number of research here, maybe 263 over more than 10 years, as listed on the Web of Science under the category of public policy. So that's why I had a question about how to increase faculty productivity and get them to do more research and publish it in international peer-reviewed journals. Now, what kind of methodologies are used? Most of the respondents reported on using mixed methods rather than either quantitative or qualitative. And these are interesting quotations that quantitative methodologies are appreciated more by the policymakers. They look better when you produce a policy paper and it has numbers on it. It's appreciated more. And another reason for using mixed methods is that sometimes data is not accessible easily in Egypt, and therefore they need to complement the quantitative analysis with a qualitative one as well. Monitoring and evaluation takes place by different types of organizations in government, by donor agencies. They have their own monitoring and evaluation departments. They use lots of consultants to do monitoring and evaluation studies, plus in academic institutions and think tanks. There's a positive thing that the Ministry of Planning is currently starting up its own impact lab, and they are considering implementing randomized controlled trials to evaluate public policies. This is a new aspect that was not there before. A number of challenges are being faced related to the study and research of public policy. On top of these challenges, data accessibility, reliability, and quality. We got a lot of comments from the respondents regarding how access to data is a big challenge, and availability of reliable data is also problematic. Issues related to the context that we work in and the restrictive political environment. People are not always comfortable speaking out to researchers, even coming from academic institutions. And the limited public policy expertise. Yes, we have these standalone programs, we have courses that deal with public policy as a subtopic, but respondents mentioned that it's not clear to many people what public policy is all about, and we sometimes import foreign understanding of what is policy and what is policy making, and lack of enough training opportunities related to public policy. There are funding issues. There are also the challenge of public policy studies not perceived as a priority by many. Outcomes of public policy research are rarely used, and it's relatively new academic field, so students may not be fully aware of what opportunities they may have if they finish a degree in public policy. They may need to talk to our graduates here. We're proud of them. There are a number of challenges also related to monitoring and evaluation of public policy. The strong influence of international donor agencies. They dominated the field of monitoring policies in Egypt. The weak evaluation competencies, the lack of an enabling environment, the high level of centralization. And then we're being here positive and trying to look for ways to overcome the challenges. Based on the respondents' also suggestions, they suggested having more policy programs in academia, more trainings and more think tanks, more links between policy researchers and policymakers. We try to do this as well in our public policy program by making sure that what we come up with in terms of policy gets to be communicated effectively to policymakers in many different ways. Not only the policy research paper, but we give them brief and we develop short advocacy videos in colloquial Arabic to get the message across. Another way also to promote policy studies in Egypt was suggested by availing necessary prerequisites for good quality policy research, not only just funds, but seeking accreditation from NASPA, which is the top-level accrediting organization in the US, and other similar accreditation body. There's IAPA, there's ICAPA, and a lot more, using more inclusive and grassroots approaches to studying and making policies. We want more implementation of good governance principles. We are suggesting here, as respondents to the survey, also doing an advocacy and promotion campaign for public policy, and enhancing M&E and impact assessment nationwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leila, for that very precise and very interesting conversation. And I'm sure that there is a session on the accreditation that could be very interesting to understand, to go on those topics. For the sake of time, I will go there and introduce my classmate and my colleagues. Dr. Anjem Khurshid, we were classmates. He's a very intelligent man, very smart. We work together. He's a member of the faculty at Harvard Medical Schools and Harvard Pilgrim Health Care Center. He's the chief data scientist for the Centennial Operations Center and the National Drug Surveillance Program. Dr. Khurshid was previously the co-chief, Health Informatics, Data Science, and Epidemiological Division, Department of Population Health, and he was an associate professor for Dell Medical Schools at the University of Texas in Austin. He is a prolific writer. He has published enormous amount of work. Also, he has tons of money, because he was showing me he has millions of dollars that he's getting it, and that's why Harvard was interested in keeping him. So, Dr. Anjem, you have 20 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Hamid. Unfortunately, all that money is grant money, so it doesn't go into my account. I have to do work for it and pay grad students. Anyway, first of all, I'll say I was just blown away by the hospitality that has been meted out to us here in Doha. The institute staff have been just wonderful, and it's great to see such a collection of talent and interest from different parts of the world, coming together in Doha. So congratulations for the successful holding of this conference. It's my first visit to Doha, so it's very interesting to see the development, infrastructure development over here as well, because I come from Boston, which is one of the oldest cities in the US. So we see infrastructure changing. That was modern maybe 50 years ago. Anyway, so when I was asked to talk about sustainability and development stages in sustainability, I really thought about when we discuss sustainability, whether we are talking of sustainability of the planet or sustainability of our populations, or sustainability of even individuals, we are really in some ways talking about the health of the planet, of the individuals, of the population. And health, it has been defined by the World Health Organization, is not just the absence of disease or crisis, but it's also the ability for an individual or an organization to be able to fulfill its full potential. As I thought about this, and since my work is mainly translational research, which is not just thinking about things, but also testing them and implementing them in the real world, So I thought I'll talk about specifically about health and then some of the opportunities that have been mentioned here, especially with some of the new technologies. And as we talk about this, we will discuss some of the examples of the work that is being going on in the US and some of the challenges we have. Needless to say, I mean, just look at the numbers and you think that if there is anything that is happening globally as a phenomena, it's the adoption of technology. It's the revolution in terms of the data that we are collecting and using and information that is being shared all over. So, and these are very conservative numbers. So 5.5 billion internet users, more than 3 billion users of just one app, which is Facebook. And then roughly more than 5.5 billion cell phone users. Again, there are estimates that these are actually more than the population of the earth, so 7 billion maybe cell phones being used in the world. So the opportunity is great in terms of thinking really globally on how we use technologies, data, information to connect these things and think about development as a whole and sustainability as a whole planet. But again, when we think about it, the thinking is really policy making. So we have to really think of what policies will help us go through this. And just to link it to the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it is clear that of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, these new opportunities and challenges that come with technology are going to affect each one of them. And even as we think of some audacious goals like, I've mentioned over here, with really increasing health access or coverage, or being able to respond to health emergencies like COVID-19 that we have all been through together, technology and data will play a very important role in terms of thinking about not only what the problem is, but also thinking about how do we respond to it and how effectively do we respond to it. Similarly, as you think of, and I've referred to the global strategy on digital health by the World Health Organization, which was the 2020-25 strategy. Again, it identifies that being able to develop these knowledge societies that we can share knowledge with each other, information with each other, creative solutions with each other, which this forum is a good example of that, but would require us to really understand the implications of data and technology, not only in healthcare, but in other fields as well. And this is not something new, but I think we knew about these changes happening. The question is, how are we responding to it? How are we responding to it as policy professionals? How are we responding to it as countries and as individuals and as regions? And that has been some of the focus of the discussions today as well. So this is kind of the context, but then coming to the more practical aspects of being able to translate this potential into actions. There is a difference between what is the promise, which we can talk all day about, and you must have seen how we have every new technology that comes in, we think that's transformative, is going to change the world. And yet, for a lot of people in this world, nothing changes, in terms of challenges, etc. And one of the challenges, I think that we use this acronym of DRIP, which is that we are collecting a lot of data. So data are being collected, everybody who's using a cell phone, everybody who is going through airports, their data are being collected. So we are really data rich, but in terms of extracting knowledge and information and wisdom from that data, I think we are falling behind. And that's why a response to an emergency crisis, a world crisis like COVID, you can see, despite the fact that we had a lot of data, but when we had to use that data to make decisions, actually we were lacking that quite a bit. In fact, we had a paper published in a policy journal where we started really looking at policies around COVID and matched it with outcomes like COVID testing, COVID results, COVID outcomes. And we realized that doing an international comparison is extremely hard because we have different definitions. We have different definitions of how even policies are implemented. We have different standards of data. So we ended up actually writing the paper about the methodology and challenges of doing an analysis like that rather than being able to do a quantitative type analysis. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, which is a challenge as we think about digital health and what we can use the new technologies in. The other aspects which are also unique, I think, to some extent with health data, but are overlapping with other sectors as well, that more and more the data that we need to make decisions is in multiple places. Everybody kind of creates their own databases because we also want to protect them well. And as a result, getting the right information together is very costly. It also takes a lot of time. This presentation, by the way, is perfectly fine to present to physicians and healthcare professionals in the US, because that's how the US healthcare system is working. But it's also fine to present it to any other sector or industry today, because these challenges are there. The challenges of fragmentation, the data being collected in multiple places and not being able to be connected together meaningfully. The challenges where we have to protect data because of privacy, confidentiality, et cetera. But at the same time, through that protection, we add controls and processes that make it very hard for those who really want that data. But it may be researchers, it may be physicians, it may be patients, or policymakers. And then also that most of this data, especially in healthcare, requires interpretation as well, in other fields as well, but requires interpretation. So it's not merely collecting of data. It is actually having the expertise to be able to interpret that data, which will go back to building capacities in state agencies and government agencies to be able to harness that data as well, which won't happen just by collecting a lot of information. It's really, you have to build the workforce and human resource that can translate that data into meaningful decisions that have to be made, or options for policymakers to choose from. So in the US, at least in healthcare, one concept that has worked, has been helpful, at least in making this framework easy to understand from a data perspective, is the concept of a learning health system. This was the Institute of Medicine, as they were looking at challenges to healthcare in the US, which many of you know that we are the highest expenditure of healthcare, or we have the highest expenditure in healthcare anywhere in the world. We spend a fifth of our economy in just healthcare, which is about $4 trillion. But at the same time, we have a lot of disparities in healthcare. We have people who don't have access to healthcare, which is kind of challenging as a system to deal with. And so this concept of a learning health system where we are providing services, but also learning from the provision of these services so that we can inform the future provision of those services. And that process may be called research, but research in the sense that we are intelligently using that information to improving our system. And the idea of this cycle, which is the framework of the learning health system, where knowledge is converted into performance, performance to data, and data is converted back to knowledge so that we can continue this cycle of improvement, is kind of how we think of a learning health system, where we are being informed by the results of our services. Again, in traditional health systems, also in many other industries, we actually don't do that. We don't fulfill the cycle. We just keep on providing services from what we think is working, which goes to a lot of comments that were made this morning as well about evaluation and the power of program evaluation, et cetera. And so as we think of healthcare and sustainability, we are really thinking of not just an individual, but we are thinking of all the factors that affect the health of a lot of individuals, because that will impact economy, that will impact all other sectors as well. So the idea of really thinking about populations and population health, which is still relatively a new idea even in the US, although in many other countries I think it had been the other way around, where we were really thinking of the whole populations from a public sector approach. But then the challenge is, how do we make this more effective in terms of using data? Because capturing data is a hard thing. It's like capturing a wild horse these days. By the way, when I made this slide, I was in Texas, so this was very relevant. So the three strategies that we have tried, at least, and have worked partly, and the federal policy has also been supporting this, because for 4 years I served on the Federal Advisory Committee for Health IT Policy at the US, which is the body that advises the government on health IT. And there are three components to how we better manage health data for population health. One is just clinical data, being able to connect correct clinical data or the relevant clinical data, which is still a challenge in many cases. But then what we also know is that there is more than clinical data that affects the health of populations. So being able to connect it to the clinical data, which are just outcomes. So clinical data is interpreted by physicians and people who are trained in it. There are other aspects of our life that physicians are not the experts on. Babysitting is not physicians' expertise, but being able to learn about that. And the third part is having the individuals. So as you think about these data, then you break it down into saying what informs healthcare data, what informs personal data, what informs social determinants of health data that we will talk about briefly. And I will give you just one example of each just to finish my part. So as we think of clinical data, the concept of interoperability where systems can talk to each other, which is not inherent in how we build systems, because we really build systems for an organizational perspective or a certain provider perspective rather than thinking of really how we can share it. And in some ways, from a business perspective, there are some advantages of not being able to share some of your data. So that's why there are adverse incentives from an economic perspective. So being able to overcome that by creating systems that can talk to each other, for which there are strategies, further strategies in terms of using standards, in terms of using, now we have APIs, which are application programming interfaces that make it easy to access data without having to involve even human beings to make that. And really thinking of an infrastructure that allows for data from multiple silos to be connected through a layer where we can implement governance, where we can implement security, where we can implement analytics, and then provide those insights to a large number of people that you see at the bottom level, which could be physicians, it could be patients, it could be policymakers, it could be anybody else who needs to use that information. So that's one of the ways in which we are addressing one aspect of which is just the clinical data, because it comes from multiple places, from labs, from pharmacies, from hospitals, from clinics, and other places. The other piece, which over the last 20 years has been an important part of public health discussion, but also population health discussion, is that we have analyzed data and realized that what we provide within hospitals and clinics only addresses disease. It does not ensure health. And what we really want for a population is that we have less people who are coming to our hospitals and clinics, because that's costly. Also, it is economically adverse, because then those people are not necessarily contributing to the economy if they are in the hospital or clinic. So you want to go what we call upstream. You want to go upstream to make sure that people are healthier, productive for a longer period of their time, which then helps the entire society in having healthy people, and therefore sustains some of these programs that we want to build. And as you see here, there are physical environmental factors, there are social and economic factors, there are other factors that affect. So clinical factors only account for 20% of the outcomes of a population, versus 80% that is controlled by other factors which are called determinants of health. And these days, the term that is being used for it is social determinants of health, but again, those terms change sometimes with time as well. So the idea of being able to then get data from environmental agencies that collect air quality data and be able to connect it to when people have asthma attacks is how do you prevent this, because asthma can be prevented if you know that there will be more triggers for asthma, for instance. That's true for diabetes, for hypertension, for other kinds of conditions as well. So as you start thinking of a population that has to be healthy in order to be productive and increase the productivity of the society, and then therefore be able to go through the developmental stages we are talking about and think of sustainability of our actions, then really thinking of these linkages, which are the linkages that we have, but because we have different providers and different ministries and different departments and different organizations that are providing these services, we don't integrate them well. So this is the idea of really integrating them. And the final part is to engage the individuals who benefit from it into this process, which is again something that when we have a very institutional hat, we almost forget who our consumers are, who are those participants, while we ourselves are also those consumers and participants in many ways. So the challenge has been that with digitization and with digital health, we sometimes are creating more silos, and we are not necessarily taking into account the needs of those who will be users, especially those who are underserved, who are the poor. So because from a financial perspective, a lot of these new technologies are benefiting people who can pay for them. So we develop iPhones and we make them more and more sophisticated, but not everybody can afford an iPhone. We develop apps like Fitbits and others, and not everybody can benefit from it, because those who are working in the fields or out in the rural areas, how do we manage to have technology really address some of those issues? And so we have built a platform, again, funded by the federal government, to really think of how can we engage patients so they get control of their data. And they can then use it for multiple purposes, including informing and educating themselves, and being able to then share that information with others without the organizational barriers that prevent some of the sharing of that information. So what I wanted to give you is just an overview of the kinds of things that we can think about as we think of developmental stages and sustainability in the broader term, but with a very specific example of health and the use of technology and data within healthcare. And I've adapted some of these strategies from the commission that was set up in England, the Lancet and Financial Times Commission. And it had come up with some suggestions, but I thought they were all very relevant in terms of, as we think of technology, as we think of digital health applications in developing countries and around the world, we should think of this as an important part of our strategy for health of our populations. We should also build trust in this health infrastructure, because what we saw during COVID was that when people were required to report data, then there was also an issue of trust with institutions that were collecting it. And it was not just in developing countries, it was also in Europe, it was also in America. There were a lot of apps that could have prevented deaths in COVID, but they were not implemented because people did not trust who was in this. Similarly, being able to then think about governance, thinking about investing in universal coverage, and more importantly in this context, being able to train the future policymakers and public administrators to understand how to harness this technology without causing some of the negative sides of adoption of this technology that may actually increase inequities in our systems. So being able to be thoughtful requires us to train the future generation to understand both the opportunities and the challenges with new technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anjum. Exactly 1 minute before the time that he's supposed to end. Thank you so much for that preciseness. Okay, for now we are moving to, because we see that we have a variety of topics. And also we have, I'm so pleased that today we have Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi. Of course, Ibrahim al-Badawi was a former finance minister of Sudan and one of the gifted economists for Sudan, not because he's here, but we know that. He is, if we have 3 economists in Sudan, I used to say that we have one is used to be called Mamoun al-Bahiri, another one is called Munir Mansour, third one is Ali Abdul Qadir, and then I said the fourth one is Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi. So he's one of the gifted economists that we have. And of course, he was in the World Bank for many years. And then he was, now he's director of the Economic Research Forum. He has also recently appointed by the Secretary General of the UN as a member of the High-Level Advisory Board for Economic Affairs. He has edited about 13 books, written about 90 articles. He has written also on Journal of Econometrics. That is, one of the high tier that is rarely anybody can write on it. And he was well trained from Northwestern University. So Dr. Ibrahim is talking about Sudan usually, and he has written tremendously about Sudan. And I will always, I nominate him to be the Secretary of Finance during the revolution, and I said this is the top one that should go for it. And he initiated the reform that currently was started, but the coup has taken place and aborted those plans. And she's going to be our future prime minister. Go ahead, Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Let me first actually, but I will go there. Let me first actually say that for all of us who know Professor Hamid, he's a very kind man and colleague. So, take some of what he said about me and some other people, I'm sure, with a grain of salt. But for me, I like to thank him, but he's too kind for his remarks. I would like first to start by really thanking the International Institute of Administrative Sciences and the School of Economic Administration and Public Policy for inviting me to participate in this very interesting international conference, and also to present myself as representing the Economic Research Forum, which is the largest and oldest regional research network in economics in the Middle East and North Africa, and would like to take this opportunity to invite actually those of you, experts who are also economists, to join us, especially those from the region, and we look forward to build partnership with the Doha Institute under the able leadership of Dr. Hamid. I have a slide which I will use, but let me very briefly, because I know that the chairman is quite a strict person, so I will try to just summarize what I wanted to say, just in case I run out of time. The Sudan is plagued with what is characterized by many scholars in Sudan, or a few scholars, some scholars in Sudan, as being afflicted by a political syndrome, أو ما يسمى بالعربي بالمتلازمة السودانية. And the political syndrome is that Sudan has been actually the leader in terms of deposing authoritarian regimes. The very first revolution that we had in Sudan was in October 1964, that deposed a military dictatorship of General Aboud. But then only 4 years after, the fragile coalitions that ruled after the revolution did not manage to stabilize the system, and it was never been able to become a developmental state. So another coup took place in 1969, the General Nimeri's regime, and that actually survived for 16 years before another uprising in March, April, it's called March, April 1985 uprising. And then another government came, but then again, the same issues, the same problem, the same political structure. So the new government became ripe for another coup, which was a coup of Omar al-Bashir that took the country to one of the darkest episodes of its political history before what we call the glorious December Revolution in 2018, deposed Omar al-Bashir regime. But unfortunately, we are still struggling with the transition, and the syndrome continues. So given this context, I'm going to speak to three issues, or the presentation. Actually, my presentation is partially based on a recent paper on exactly the same title, the syndrome. So the three premises is that the developmental state for Sudan requires first to deal with the political syndrome. That's the very basic thing. But then on the other hand also, in order to deal with the syndrome, we need actually development, economic development, which is of course by extension requires a developmental state. So these two aspects defines a low political economic equilibrium trap, that actually we need to shock this equilibrium so that we can actually go to the good equilibrium. And this requires a social contract. And this is the third premise. And this social contract necessarily has to have both political and economic aspects or political components. So I will speak to these three issues now using the slides, is very briefly to discuss the making of the syndrome as a background, and then to speak about the theory of the narrow corridor. There is a recent book that came out called The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Freedom. It's one of the most highly publicized book in development circles in 2019. And the two authors are Professor Daron Acemoglu, a university professor, professor very well known in the field of economics, and his co-author, James Robinson, political scientist from Chicago and Harvard, and they moved to Chicago. So this narrow corridor theory is very relevant to explaining the syndrome for the case of Sudan, which I will try to employ it very quickly in this context. And then the idea of the developmental state as an elite's bargain. Again, this is a new literature about how a developmental state come to be. And it's some sort of a byproduct of an elite's bargain. This is maybe one of many theories, but it looks like the most trendy theory these days people talk about. And it relates to a new book also by Professor Stephen Dercon from Oxford University, who used to be the chief economist for the British DFID. And then the last item is about thinking about a social contract for Sudan. So let me, without further ado, move to quickly go over the. So the context really is the revolution in Sudan, which is, and how the syndrome play out. Let me just. Is this the right thing? Is this the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
You can use the pointer.
Uh-huh.
You can use this.
How is it? Okay. Okay. So you can see that, this, what we call in Sudan the revolution, is quite a vigorous social mobilization. And in terms of geographic coverage, it covers the entire of the country, including, especially in the capital here in the middle, and so on. I wanted just to quote back in 1953, the well-known news magazine Newsweek had the cover picture, somebody from the Presidential Guard of Sudan, a country that was about to become independent from the British rule in 1956, and the newspaper said, Sudan, bright spot in a dark continent. And that expectation was actually well justified then, because Sudan was, bequeathed from the British by one of the best educational system and civil servants and independent judiciary, and a 2.5 million acre under one management, the Jazeera scheme, which was the top producer of cotton for the British, manufacturing, textile manufacturing. And so people expected, observers expected, that will be the fate of Sudan as a major developing country in Africa. Unfortunately, this could never be more wrong, because actually the country was defined with conflicts and instability, and the syndrome that I just told you about. There was so much discussion about why this has been the fate of Sudan. There are so many factors which I wouldn't have time to go through. So I would basically maybe show you this table, which probably shows very clearly the extent of polarization and social fractionalization in Sudan, compared even to sub-Saharan Africa and other Arab countries. You can see that Sudan is highly polarized and fractionalized along ethnic and religious line, especially when before the secession of South Sudan and the partitioning of the country in 2011. And so on, we could go into political polarization. So all of these are well discussed in the paper, which I shared with Dr. Hamid for those who might want to actually. So let me, talk about some takeaways in terms of this polarization. Clearly, the mismanagement of diversity and polarization has been discussed in the literature as one of the major factors behind political instability and violent conflicts, including large-scale violence like civil wars. And therefore, these structural characteristics of the Sudanese society have to be part of the factors. But then the argument that I will make is that it cannot really fully explain the syndrome. Why? Because there are many other dogs, as they say, that did not bark, meaning that there are many other societies that are highly fractionalized, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Tanzania, for example, is one example. You have Julius Nyerere, who basically remodeled the Tanzanian society by injecting Swahili, focusing on Swahili as a national language, and the Ujuma, for example, principle as we are all together in it, and was able to overcome, despite all the problems with development, at the political level, was able to overcome the diversity and fractionalization, and many other examples could be cited. The second question is why the elites did not learn, even if they are, setbacks back in 1964. Why the Sudanese elite did not manage to benefit from the experience and move forward. So there is need for a much more deliberative, much more kind of model-based approach, rather than saying, well, Sudan is highly fractionalized, diverse, and polarized between North and South, and this has been a major factor behind instability and so on, and underdevelopment. So the explanation is this narrow corridor model. Basically, this model, which is due to these authors, and basically this model, they produce actually not only the book, but several highly technical papers using game theoretic approaches to explain this model. But basically, a graphical representation would suffice for this purpose. This is an Euclidean space with 2 dimensions. In the horizontal, the strengths of society in the horizontal. And in the vertical, the strengths of the elites controlling the state. And this defines actually 4 types of states, or 4 types of state-society context. You have a situation where in the very extreme in the horizontal, you have a very strong society, but disarticulated in the sense that it is actually in silos. Either the social capital is not bonded across elements of the society. For example, in Lebanon, you have very high social capital within the sectarian association. The Shia, the Sunnah, the Christians, and so on. In Somalia, you have, according to the clan, highly strong social capital, but it has been very difficult to bond this social capital. And that would actually cause the state to be weak by construction. So you have a situation where you have a strong society and weak state. Then you have the other extreme on the vertical axis. When you have a very strong state controlled by the elites and weak society. And within this, you have a developmental authoritarian state, like the state that is controlled now by the Chinese Communist Party. It's a developmental state, but a very strong state that has been very capable and achieved development. But according to this model, that state it still has to resolve eventually a problem that I will explain. And then you have a paper authoritarian state, a state that can be quite brutal, but is incapable of achieving development, either because it does not exercise monopoly on violence, so it is phased, it was challenged by civil wars and by rebel movements and so on, and also it does not spend in education and health and infrastructure, so it does not deliver public goods. And this state, the state that ruled Sudan under the Inghaz regime of Omar al-Bashir, was this typical state that is quite brutal, but very inefficient, and does not control violence, and neither can it deliver public goods. So the idea is that the contest between society and the elites that control the state follows a narrow corridor, which is this corridor. And development happens when there is some sort of relatively balanced strengths of the two. So when you have a strong society, the strong society requires the state to be accountable to deliver public goods. And then the elites who are responsive and accountable to the society, they also demand people to pay taxes and to obey the law. And therefore, you have a positive sum relationship, what we call in Arabic, mu'adala kasbiya. And so this positive sum relationship leads the society and the state to develop a relationship, a cooperative win-win relationship, moving up the corridor until you reach a mature, established democracy. The situation in Sudan is such that actually a revolution happens and equalize the contest in favor of the society vis-a-vis a dominant elites, and usually in our case military elites, and get Sudan into the corridor. Like, for example, the pass number 1 here is that after the December Revolution, we moved, and the removal of the Inghaz cabal, we moved this way to the right, and we enter the corridor, but it's the narrowest part of the corridor. So any kind of shock will move us out of the corridor. And that is what has happened repeatedly for 3 times in the case of Sudan. The lessons to be had from this is that actually the Sudanese society is strong enough to undermine eventually an authoritarian dictatorship, but they don't really have the cohesion to allow them to stay in the corridor and move forward. Meaning that the revolutionary forces or the democracy forces, once they achieve the goal of moving the society into the corridor, problems start to mount, disagreements, and failure to develop a common denominator in a way of social contract. So that's the problem. And obviously, there are 3 factors that usually associated with inability to stay in this corridor and move upward. First of all, massive polarization within the society. So the polarization is partially an important factor, and failure to manage it, and lack of credible institution as arbiters. You know, for example, if you think of Tunisia, we have the Labor Association, which goes back to the 1930s. It's a very strong, powerful institution, and is now acting as an arbiter. We don't have that institutional arbiter. You used to have the professional association, but then because of political infighting, that professional association disintegrated along political lines and could not sustain that role. And then, of course, major economic and political crisis. So I can tell you all of these three factors are there in Sudan and has really been the factor. So what to do? How can we address this? And obviously, there is no developmental state because the elites are not agreeing to develop a bargain, a development bargain. And this development bargain is very important because actually, it's actually almost, the name of the book was Gambling with Development. Okay. Can I have, Mr. Chairman, just 3 more minutes? Okay. So they could not do that. Maybe I will answer in the question what the development bargain mean, and then I move straight to the social contract. I want to use, this is written in Arabic, but I will speak in English because I have quite a few colleagues from South Africa. I actually think the social contract of South Africa, as well as the transitional justice experience, is extremely educational for the case of Sudan and maybe other countries in the Arab region. And actually, the major transformation and majority rule in South Africa has led to a Renaissance project that achieved from 1994 to 2010 one of the highest growth rates in Africa. And the reason for that was because of the charismatic leadership and the moral high grounds that Nelson Mandela commanded. And so that allowed an aspirational message, aspirational kind of message, national narrative. And that national narrative is buttressed and supported by the agreement between the ANC and the National Party that ruled South Africa then. So there was a very clear message to the popular base in South Africa that there is going to be a good future. And that future will be geared towards addressing the accumulated historical imbalances and grievances. And so the popular base of the black and colored community, they accepted the short-term cost of reforms in anticipation of development. Then also the elites themselves, they developed a deal. It's a developmental deal. It's not really a deal that is a corrupt deal or a shady deal. It's a developmental deal of the Black Empowerment Act that actually let us keep the achievement of the white South African regime, especially the industrial sector, but then empower the black elites, the black middle class, to own shares in the companies and to achieve upward mobility as entrepreneurs. And this have actually led to changing the expectations of the private sector and investment. And I think this actually engineering of the social contract is very important and very educational, as opposed to what happened in Zimbabwe, for example, where basically you destroy everything. You destroyed agriculture, and I think the reason being because of the democratic nature of the ANC and the astute and wise leadership of Nelson Mandela. For the case of Sudan, I think we need to build a political space to exchange ideas. We need a national narrative, and we need actually an inspirational, well-studied program in order to promote this social contract. The political aspects of the social contract is really, I think, Sudan is not really ready for Westminster democracy. Perhaps maybe we need some sort of a strong federal system with a mixed presidential premiership with 2 bicameral legislature. And we need a government of national unity, regardless of what happened in the election. That is very critical, at least for the forced democracy or the forced parliamentary democracy, presidential democracy. We need a government of national unity. For the issue of development, we need to set very strong agenda. There is a rule in economics called the rule of 70, that actually, if you manage to grow by 10%, the economy will double for every 7 years. And I think this is like a moonshot strategy. What happened here in Qatar, the World Cup, hosting the World Cup was like a moonshot principle that President Kennedy set for putting a man in the moon. I've been here in Doha in 2016, and I could see that setting this objective motivates everybody, the state and the society, to be prepared for that day. I think we need to do that. We need to say, let us grow by 10% at least, because we are a country coming out of a major dysfunctional system. There is a huge catch-up growth that we can achieve. And let us double the Sudanese economy in 7 years. And I think that will happen, and that will actually condition the political class to think about economics, to think about development, and to achieve economic legitimacy, not just political legitimacy. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we are squeezing the speakers very hardly to make it, and now we will keep the best for the last. We have Yolsa Makhashi. She is the Director General of Economic Services and Administration for South Africa. She is appointed by the President. Also, she was growing her way from the bureaucracy of the civil society. And she worked at the provincial government, and she has graduated of Manchester University. Also, you are going to have 20 minutes, so.
Thank you, moderator, and good afternoon or good evening. Which one is it? Good afternoon to everybody in the house. If you allow me, and I can just say all protocol observed, which means everybody here is important and is acknowledged. Moderator, I feel like such an underachiever because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I was advised I don't need one. And it's my first time participating in this conference, so I had to really live by what I believed were the rules of the conference. So I'm just going to read from what I had prepared for this engagement, and I apologize for that. I also just feel left out because everybody knows each other from this panel. They studied together or did something together. And I feel left out. Just before I start my presentation, I just want to reflect on a few issues which I think are crucial for state capacity. I attended the PhD seminar yesterday, focusing on digital transformation and innovation. And it became quite clear to me that the digital space is critical, and that as South African government, we must develop and implement an agile digital strategy for the country. It is also clear that resources, leadership, and I mean values-based leadership, at political level as well as at managerial level, and public-private collaboration is critical for us in pursuing this digital transformation agenda and innovation. We are as a country still quite far, in my assessment, from achieving this idea of a digital development state I heard about yesterday. Secondly, I don't know if Professor Haig is still here, but he stated earlier on that South Africa is not a developmental state. I suppose because mainly he said its bureaucracy is not autonomous and politicians interfere. I am part of the bureaucracy and playing quite a critical role as a head of department in the bureaucracy. And, but I do want to just say that I don't think it's such an easy, it would be so easy, at least for the South African context, to categorize us. But I do want to say that what I'm presenting today is to basically say that we have great intentions of being a developmental state, and we have moved. There's certain areas where South Africa has done quite well. There's areas where we definitely need to improve. And one of those areas that we have done quite well is that, I think since democracy, 1994, we have managed as a country to do so much for the people, especially those who are underprivileged, in terms of providing human settlements, in terms of just access to basics like electricity. When I grew up in South Africa, I was born in the 70s. When I grew up in South Africa, in my home where I grew up in the township, there was no electricity. So we used candles. Right through my schooling system, I used candles, reading. But my children who are, we call them the 2000, I'm a 2000, who were born in the 2000, have experienced a different life because there is electricity, not just in my house because I could be seen as an elite who's part of government, but even in my family, those who have never worked for government, or some who have never even worked because of interventions that were done by government. So it may seem like these are ordinary things, but in our context, they have never been ordinary. It has never been easy to access electricity. It has never been easy to access tap water pre-1994. So I just wanted to bring that issue around a context that I think for us, there's a little bit of complexity around these particular matters. But certainly, I think that more can be done, especially in terms of public administration, to liberate the public sector from what generally people call political interference, but I want to call it, I want to speak about it more from a political and administrative interface rather than interference, political interference, because I believe that politicians have a role, and in the public policy space, politics play a role. So you cannot want to wish away politics when you deal with public policy, complex public policy related matters. So I just want to, I thought let me raise those two issues. But the central theme of this conference, being a developmental state and professionalization of public service and public policy, aligns very well with the South African priorities included in our National Development Plan, in particular Chapter 13, focusing on building a capable and developmental state. The NDP makes commitments to build a state that is capable of playing developmental and transformative role. It further makes commitments to professionalize the public service. I have a colleague here from South Africa who basically led the process of developing a framework to professionalize the public service. He is the principal of our National School of Government, and he's sitting right in the corner there at the back. So if you want to talk to him further, it was his project. He will be able to give you more information. The National Development Plan is a long-term developmental vision for South Africa based on an outline of sector-specific goals and a vision to be achieved by the year 2030. Chapter 13 of the NDP identifies critical interventions to build a professional public service and a state capable of playing a transformative developmental role in realizing the vision for 2030. Whilst chapter 14 focuses on promoting accountability and fighting corruption. This is a very important issue for us because, again, your developmental state is important that we fight corruption, we build ethics, we build integrity of public sector leaders and public sector workers, hopefully also of members of society at large. The key strategic goals of Chapter 13 and 14 of our National Development Plan therefore inform the policy and program interventions that the department I lead embarks on, and generally the government of the country. During the current administration, which is the sixth administration, President Ramaphosa further has elevated this work to priority one of government's medium-term strategic framework. This medium-term strategic framework is really a 5-year plan that operationalizes the big vision of the National Development Plan. So this work we do on building state capacity is part of priority one. We report to the president and to cabinet. We're probably one of the clusters that go to the cabinet so many times to present on various aspects of building capacity of the state from an administrative capacity point of view in the country. Just as a background, I'm not going to spend much time on this background, but just to highlight that our public service is comprised of 1.2 million public servants. This is at a national and provincial government level. Of these, we have about 9,800 who are members of the senior management service. This is at the leadership level, and we have 72 heads of departments based at national government departments as well as provincial level government departments. The public sector as a whole, which would include legislature, local government. I have a number of colleagues as well here from local government who are part of the South African delegation, as well as state-owned enterprises or state-owned companies, takes the number of public servants, if broadly defined, to around 1.8 million in total. In terms of our mandate, the Constitution, Chapter 10, highlights the values of public service, and just at a high level, we are expected to really be, to have a high standard of professional ethics as public servants. We are expected to be development-oriented, amongst others. We must be accountable. There must be participation of people in our public policy processes. So sometimes our public policy processes will take a very long time because we must consult with people, we must engage people, and we must find them where they are and engage with them. Chairperson, the conversation about values is quite critical for us in public administration, as we are of service to the members of the public. We are expected to be respectful, to be humble, to treat everyone with respect and professionalism in the delivery of public services. These values also play a role in building ethics and integrity of any nation, and these are essential traits or characteristics required in the fight against corruption and building an ethical state. Values helps us to self-regulate. And because values are a social construct, you can learn values, you can learn good values, you can unlearn bad values if you are committed in the process. Our legislative mandate centers around setting up norms and standards in the public service on a number of areas: human resource development, information management, and etc. And I want to just go into the context now in relation to this developmental state we're talking about, that the National Planning Commission has defined the development state as a state which deliberately, conceptually, ideologically, and purposefully is rooted on the quest to progressively advance the socio-economic conditions of its citizens, both individually and collectively. In this regard, the South African developmental state model is rooted on the following pillars. From an ideological outlook, we look at the socio-economic conceptual foundation. That is the way the ruling party thinks of its work through the state, based on advancing development and transformation agenda. So for us, it's not just economic development, but it's embedded in the transformation agenda, taking into account our historical background of exclusion in the past. Governance arrangements, systems, and processes that are purposefully designed to drive the development agenda. Leadership, ethics, morality, that in its exercise is consciously designed to effect development and transformation. transparency, accountability and responsibility, productive state, intervention is at the plight of the most vulnerable groups. Since the dawn of democracy in South Africa in 1994, the ruling party, the African National Congress, has been confronted with developing a development agenda, an appropriate organization of the state, and a bureaucratic capacity to advance its developmental goals. Whilst developmental state debate centers on economic growth, for us in South Africa, the quest for this developmental agenda is actually imposed by our history of segregation. In essence, South Africa's quest for a developmental state is mainly a socio-economic corrective measure. It is an attempt not only meant to grow the economy, yes, we need to grow the economy, but also to address the apartheid socio-economic patterns of exclusion based on race mainly. In the process, the post-1994 democratic state also had the odd task of simultaneously building state capacity whilst meeting the socio-economic needs of the deprived majority, whilst also meeting the fears and expectations of the minorities that had enjoyed the protection by apartheid state over time. This is further exacerbated by the unequal access to resources. An example in case I want to share a little bit is a case of a civil rights organization called the AfriForum, which is basically a civil rights organization or an NGO that is led by African-speaking people, for African-speaking people fighting for their civil rights. And I want to juxtapose this up against an organization called Abahlali Basemjondolo, which means basically Abahlali Basemjondolo, they define themselves as a socialist shack dwellers movement in South Africa. So they don't have formal housing, most of them, they live in shacks. And so they organize land occupations. If there's empty space of land, you wake up tomorrow, they've occupied the land. It's not only them now, there's lots, even some who are in political parties occupy the land that may be in opposition of the ANC. They build communes and campaigns against eviction and xenophobia for public houses. AfriForum, it has access to resources. Historically, it's financed. Some of its members and leaders own companies. They run the private sector because of historical reasons. So, oh, my time is already up. Sorry. I don't even know what to say, but I just want to wrap this part, Chairperson. Thank you. So the AfriForum has access to resources and therefore does not mind taking government to court every day to fight decisions of government. Abahlali Basemjondolo have no resources completely. Theirs is to organize toys and organize protests outside of the court system because they cannot afford to pay the legal fees. So I just thought, let me highlight that a little bit, that our model, our developmental model, therefore, is much more holistic than the states that are simply besieged with just growing the economy. South Africa's developmental state entails growing the economy and transformation, expanding the reach of democratic state machinery, building a moral, ethical, bureaucratic machinery, building governance system, undertaking measures for nation building, reconciliation, as well as building South Africa's diplomatic presence. I want to move and just to highlight in respect to professionalization, which is an area I was also asked to talk about, that we've done some work, we've taken it to cabinet, we've addressing a number of issues through our professionalization framework, and I did indicate we have a colleague here who can also chat with you about it, but we want to stabilize our political administrative interface in government. The relationship between executive authority, which is your political office bearer, and accounting officers is very important. We want to deal with career incidents of accounting officers. We want merit-based recruitment and selection processes. We want consequences management. We want to utilize distinguished former public servants and senior public representatives. There are pillars that guide this, things like pre-entry requirements and selection processes, induction and onboarding, planning and performance management, continuing learning and professional development, career progression and career incidence. As I close, Chair, I do want to say that I cannot close without speaking about gender a little bit, just to say that one of the areas where I think as a country we've made decisive interventions is around the empowerment of women. We, early on in the democracy, Cabinet took a decision that 50% of everything in government must be women. And I think that we've worked hard around that. The latest statistics I've checked, which have shown me that we are going a little bit down now, showed me that in the public service, we have 44% of women in senior management positions. And the target is 50%. So we are working hard around achieving this target and even going beyond, because a target is to achieve and go beyond. Esteemed guests, I have attempted to share critical lessons from the South African state on leading development. There's a lot that can be said if we had time, but I have attempted with the time I have. I have also demonstrated how the public service and administration is responsible for leading the modernization of the public service through norms and standards. We have a number of challenges, but we are confronting those challenges, and we are working towards really this developmental state that achieves the economic growth, but also deals with matters of the past that we have to deal with from a segregation and an exclusion point of view. Also attending to our vulnerable groups in society in terms of development. I would like to leave it here and thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that we are almost ready for a break and break from the work. What I will do is, just to do a justice for the speakers, I'm going to take about three questions. If you have a comment, please make it very brief. I'm going to take 2 questions from this side, 1 question from that side, and 1 question from this side. All right? Okay, so, all right. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, one on the, okay, all right, go there. Since you are there, just save the time.
Thank you very much for the speakers. Shukran jazilan. I personally enjoyed all the presentations. My question to Leila Badi. I enjoyed the presentation, particularly the bits about the history of public policy, the field. It emerged in the 1960s, interdisciplinary, and also some books mentioned that it emerged in, it's a Western field, emerged in the USA and so on. My question to you is that, and you mentioned one small, very important statement, that the field is state-oriented, it's not global. My question to you is, how would the field of public policy look like if it had been formed or constructed within Africa? That's my question to you. For Dr. Badawi, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned colonialism, and you talked about the Closed District Act. And when we come to the analysis actually, you know, of course, we need to read the paper because of the pressure of time. But when you come to the analysis, the analysis actually tended to be synchronic, not historical. Because the question is, where is the effect of colonialism on the current configuration of the state in Sudan? The impression which I had is that colonialism finished. Now we need to talk about relationship between the state, society, and liberty, using that model. Well, colonialism, we still live in conditions of colonialism. Didn't finish. So my question to you is, this is a point which I think we need, it needs to be taken into account. And my question is this: there is a resistance committees in Sudan, which is revolutionary groups, launched 2 days ago the final version of the revolutionary charter for establishing people's power. My question to you is, don't you think, or do you think that, you know, charter, don't you think it contains at least, you know, the historical vision or a vision about the syndrome, the way out of this syndrome. And so now I invite all of you to read that charter, please. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ashraf, for the announcement. Okay, so come here.
Thank you very much. I want to ask Mr. Al-Badawi, what have your ministry experience changed in your expectation of solutions that you came with, and change your perspective on the analysis of the situation? So you came with some solutions, you came with some plans, you experienced a good while of experience in Sudan, being in the depth of the ministry and the cabinet and the people and the economical finance in hands. Some change has happened from that time to now. It added to your solutions package, and you are now looking even in an iBird view of the whole issue. Does that give you today a solid, clearer, crystal clear perspective to the solutions? Because I felt, maybe because of short of time, that the solutions is still in the rhythm of analysis, not reaching in a ripe, concrete direction. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Hamza Mozina, and then, okay.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I am Mohammed Abu Zainab from Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. My question is to Dr. Khurshid. Given the digital divide in the world, is there a risk of monopoly, more concentration of the massive data on health? And how can we minimize that? Because this may widen health inequality in the world. And this is a serious risk for us in developing countries, actually. More and more data are concentrated in the Silicon Valley. So how can we minimize the risk of this on health inequality? Thank you.
Good evening. Ala Hamad from Palestinian National School of Administration. My comment also to Mr. Professor Khurshid regarding the data. I really appreciate your presentation and your valuable paper linking the data science with the technology to have a better information systems. As you know, we are living now in the era of big data and digitization, and now we have many techniques such as for data mining, such as RapidMiner and another software programs. I think no, we can look to the full cup of a glass, not to share the knowledge, to share and the data. Maybe we can benefit from the data mining for have better visualization, and so we can have key performance indicators for systems for work, so that we can have better decisions and have better information, and we can share maybe this data to have low cost and to have rapid and better decisions and policies. Thank you.
Okay, well, just give Dr. Najat, and I think we will conclude. I'm just, with my all deep sorrow, I will conclude after that, so that, okay, Dr. Nadar, you are very pressing. Okay, let's, all right, give me one so that you don't get upset from me. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. My first comment for our brother from Sudan, he mentioned three major factors for the failure to take this corridor, political, economic, etc. But I would like to add another one, is are we sure, and it was mentioned by the previous comment, are we sure that we are independent? No, we're not. So this is the other factor to add to our to make sure that we are taking this corridor. It's a matter also of having strong states, And today, with all this challenging context, I think we need states as chameleons. So in the same day, they have to be human, they have to be gendarme and the police, military one when they are facing terrorism, they have to be social and economic driven. In the same day, we need a chameleon states to be adapted to this challenging context and to respect the human rights, of course. What I can suggest also, you know that ECOSOC has adopted in 2018 11 principles of effective governance based on 3 pillars. The first one is effectiveness. We cannot have a strong state if there is no competency, is there no a sound policy making, if there is no coherence in the policy at the national or subnational level. The second pillar is accountability. We need good rulers, leaders that respect their position, whether they are appointed or elected. And finally, we need inclusiveness, leaving no one behind, no discrimination, subsidiarity. So when you give the chance to this subnational level, to the civil society, to the private sector, to the academia, to be a part of this dynamic, we can make change. It's a matter of trust, and the trust is political. The problem of elections, when we organize election, we make sure we have fair elections, is economic trust. Leave the private sector do its business without any conflict of interest. And finally is the social trust. So this is some ingredient to build a strong and developmental states. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, last, Dr. Nadar, and we conclude the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ham. Very quick question to Dr. Al-Badawi, although you received many questions. What is the international community influence? Just give you, in your analysis, just give you one example for our case in Tunisia. In 2011, the G20, they promised a lot of money to support the transition, but 13 years later, there is, we failed because of economic conditions that, undermine the democratic process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to give the speakers 2 minutes each. Dr. Ibrahim might be 3 minutes. So we can conclude this one. Okay, Dr. Leila, go ahead.
You're very generous, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Hamid, and thank you for the very interesting question. In my presentation, yes, I mentioned that most of the policy studies that are developed in Egypt, they focus just on Egypt, and that's what I meant by being state-oriented. And they are Western-centric, the models that we use in teaching and doing research about public policy. So we borrow the models and the theories from the West and try to implement them in the context in Egypt. The question was, what about if we use theories emanating from the African continent? I think this is a very interesting question. I think we can come up with theories that explain reality, how public policies are made, either in an authoritarian context or in a non-authoritarian context, and take into consideration the cultural, political, and value system of the many African countries that we live in. They are not homogeneous. Each country may have its own value system, its own system of regulating participation and allowing for participation of its citizens in the public policy making process. So I call upon researchers, including myself, to try to come up with theories based on our own African context. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So one of my 2 minutes can be given to Dr. Brahari. I think the question, and both the questions related to data and also the digital divide and its implications. And I think those are valid concerns. Currently, in fact, there are 2 things that are important. One is that a lot of the big data is actually not being used by government. They're used by non-state actors. And even within the US, as you have mentioned, there is probably more data with some of these companies than it is with the federal government. And therefore, regulating them has been a challenge because our laws and our regulations are far behind where technology has taken us. So all our rules and regulations are actually very protective right now for new technologies, while businesses are using it and using it in ways that are, in one way at least, benefiting individuals. That's why they are being used. So Facebook is being used by 3 billion people because they find some value in it. It is not being forced on them. So I think that's why the challenge for government, especially developing countries, is that while this is a concern, on the other hand, it is also an opportunity to actually bridge some of the gaps that had not been bridged because of the industrial development and colonialism and the rules that were built 100 years ago in terms of how institutions work and how policies work. So I think the idea of this agile policy making, the idea of being reactive rather than being prepared for this future, which is going to come, and we are already seeing that, is to be able to train policymakers and leaders of the future to understand what is going on. That training is happening in businesses, which are becoming bigger than countries now. And so therefore, I think it will have implications in terms of our society and who has control over these societies. We can spend a lot of time thinking about the role of nation states, but I think what is discussed less in public administration and public policy is the role of these large businesses, which are in most cases, basically technical companies. The largest companies in the world are, Google, Amazon, Apple. So they are not people who are building ships and cars. They are people who are managing our data. And so therefore, I think we have to train ourselves to be able to address that. There are regional areas where people have kind of taken some steps to be more cognitive of these changes. So the European Union's rules around privacy, confidentiality, at least is putting some pressure on some of these companies. But look at the difference where they are not negotiating with countries. They are negotiating with Google and Amazon. And in some cases, they are negotiating almost against the wishes of the users, although they are trying to protect the rights of the users. So I think that's a model that we have to really think of what the new public administration and new public policy making would look like in another 10 years when technology would have moved further. The last thing I'll say is that, but one of the movements within technology and within data is the peer-to-peer sharing of information. So the issues of blockchain and cryptocurrency, they are moving in that direction. So are some of the delivery of services where we can create these network economies and kind of build trust with that, rather than having centralized institutions that are trying to impose in a very rapidly changing environment, where a technology that started like 2 years ago, by the time we even learn what that technology is, it has already been adopted by 1 billion people. So those are the kinds of changes that we have to be ready for, and that's the kind of curricula that we need to have. I mean, a few years ago when Dr. Hamid had asked me to talk to some of the students about e-government, I looked at public policy curricula in universities, even in the US. And there are very few curricula that emphasize or focus on digital changes and digital transformation that is happening. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Let me start with Engineer Hashim Ibn Auf. And Hashim, by the way, is a former state minister in the Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure, and he's a very good engineer. So his question is about the bottom line. So what is the bottom line? I guess this is the question. I think the bottom line really is that, let me put this in context, because the forces of freedom and change, which was the ruling coalition during the first phase of the transitional government, organized a workshop to evaluate their performance. And they asked me, among others who contributed to other issues, they asked me to write a paper on the experience of the economic sector or the economic issues. And one of the things that I pointed out was that part of the demise of the coalition or of the government then was that the coalition did not really pay attention to the importance of a galvanizing message, national narrative that actually give clear promises that are actionable, and then explaining the cost of achieving these promises. I think this is a concrete idea that is very important for any transition, that actually you are coming from a situation which is so dire economically. I will tell you, as a Minister of Finance, we reached a stage where we were struggling to get $5 million to pay for the Turkish company in the Red Sea that is providing electricity to Port Sudan, one of the most important cities in the country where we have the port. And the governor of the Red Sea came with his resignation to the Prime Minister because he said he is not willing to accept the responsibility for doing this. So the Prime Minister called me, and we struggled to get the 5 million so that we can pay. And I can tell you so many untold horror stories about this. So the former regime was a kleptocratic regime per excellence, which is institutional corruption, systematic destruction of every element, vitality of a society and a country that you can think of. So rather than actually educating the public about the dire consequences that we have, as well as giving a message that is, well studied and consistent with science, they started to attack the government, especially the Minister of Finance and the Ministry and so on, and then issuing some, exotic statements like we will depend on ourselves, we don't deal with the World Bank, we don't deal with the IMF, and we have actually debt of more than $60 billion, more than twice the GDP of Sudan. So I think this experience and the analysis like this suggests that you have to have a concrete plan that is based on realistic assessment of the situation and a message that is realistic, and then also economic legitimacy, because many of our political parties, including those in the coalition and those in the opposition, they don't seem to appreciate the importance of economic legitimacy. That actually, when you implement the rule of 70, in 7 years, when you double the national product, then you can double the budget for education, you can double the budget for health, you can double the budget for infrastructure, and even you can double the budget for national defense and security. And so these are, I think, the messages that the elites needs to be held accountable for, and to educate the society, the public about it. And I think once we have that, then you in the ministry, this important ministry, and I know you have developed a very commendable strategy for infrastructure transformation in the country, but with only 7% in revenue of GDP, fiscal effort that is one of the lowest in Africa, and a GDP that is actually half of the Sudanese GDP before the separation of the South, you will not be able to achieve much. You will not be able to spend on health. You will not be able to spend on education. And then when you talk this cheap talk about, this is the World Bank prescription, this is the IMF prescription, and you forget that actually the fairest dam in the country, the Roseris Dam, was actually built by a loan from the World Bank. And so if we have a national agenda that we debate as a society and we agree to, then we should look for partners. And we should not, refrain, and all these countries around us. I can give you the example of Ethiopia, because it is 100 million plus people. In 2020, they received $9 billion, $3 billion from the World Bank, $9 billion from $3 billion from the European Union, and $3 billion from the United States. So we are entitled as a low-income country that achieved a revolution that excited, the free people of the world and in the community and in our Arab and African neighborhood. Everybody was supportive. And unfortunately, what failed, I think, the experiment was that the heritage of the regime was not only the destruction of institutions and physical infrastructure, but also the isolation of thinking and minds, and even the left-wing parties did not appreciate and understand the development that happened in Vietnam and China, and how the ruling communist parties, they have transformed themselves and embraced market discipline and market fundamentals, but then they also continue to spend on social sector, and that is what we try to do. So I think these are important lessons that hopefully we can derive messages from. And in the paper, which I didn't have a chance, of course, I actually went into much more details. Let me very quickly, the issue that Dr. Ashraf raised, I think it will be a shame for us as Sudanese after almost 70 years of independence, we continue to talk about colonialism. And let me just say what Nazar Gabbani said on هوامش على دفتر النكسة. I'm sorry to say this in Arabic. ما دخل اليهود من حدودنا وإنما تسربوا كالنمل من عيوبنا. That continues to be valid for us, I think. Finally, let me say that I actually referred to the version of the People's Authority or Sultat al-Shab in the paper, but I don't, while the youth, of course, have really paid a heavy price, and they are the one keeping the revolution alive in Sudan. But this is a peaceful, urban-based revolution. It is not like an armed, rural revolution that will actually come and occupy cities and basically remove the sovereign institutions. This is a revolution that has to reach a deal with the sovereign institution, especially the army. Obviously, not a deal that sacrifices the fundamentals and the demands of the people, but you cannot really actually achieve anything using an urban-based peaceful revolution without a deal. You have to have a deal. But the quality of this deal depends on the unity of the forces of change. And unfortunately, the unity is no longer there. So that's really the problem, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wahim. Do you have any comments or conclude? No, I'm good. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for the great speakers. And very interesting. And we're looking forward for there's the break, right? There's something. What we have? It's over. Okay, there's the reception, right? Okay, so enjoy the reception, and thank you so much.